You've heard the saying, don't mess with a man's property, but Karen didn't get the memo. It all started one quiet afternoon when I was finishing up some work around the farm, just minding my business, thinking about the next batch of crops I'd be planting. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of my barn door creaking open. I froze, my heart racing. It wasn't my dog, it wasn't one of the workers, it was Karen. She'd been an issue before, always snooping around the neighborhood, acting like she owned more than her own yard. But this time, she took it too far. I walked toward the barn and saw her, Karen, sneaking inside with a smirk on her face, probably thinking she was getting away with something. What she didn't know was that this time, I wasn't going to let her walk away. I had been more than patient with her. Time after time, Karen had stuck her nose into my business, making complaints to the HOA, sending threats over trivial things like the color of my mailbox, or the placement of my fence. Every time I ignored her, thinking she'd move on to someone else. But not today. Today, I was going to give her a lesson she wouldn't forget. I didn't know what she was after in my barn, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going to let her walk off with my property again. I watched from behind the barn door as she rummaged through my tools and supplies, clearly not expecting anyone to stop her. A quick glance at the clock told me I had a few minutes before the police would arrive. This was going to be fun. I made my move. Without making a sound, I crept around to the other side of the barn and slid the latch into place, locking the door behind her. I could hear her muttering and rustling inside, probably thinking she could just slip out unnoticed. She didn't realize that I had cameras set up all around the property. As soon as she stepped inside, I knew exactly what she was doing. Her every move was captured. I took out my phone, hit record, and waited. I could hear her voice getting louder as she realized the door was locked. "Hello? Let me out," she shouted, but I just sat back and watched. The sweet sound of her frustration was music to my ears. The best part? She had no idea I'd called the police the moment I locked the door. They were already on their way. As the minutes passed, I could hear her becoming more frantic, banging on the walls, trying to force her way out. She even tried to break the lock with a metal rod she found in the corner. But by then, it was too late. The cops were almost here, and I had the perfect footage to prove she was trespassing. "Let me out," she screamed, pounding on the barn door with all her might. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a wave of satisfaction wash over me. It was time to let the law take over. A few minutes later, I heard the sirens. The police arrived, and I couldn't help but smile as they walked up to the barn. I unlocked the door and stepped aside as they opened it. Karen was standing there, red-faced and panting, looking like she had just lost a battle. The officers didn't say much. They knew exactly what was going on. One of them glanced at me, then back at her, and in that moment, I realized the truth. Karen had underestimated me. She thought she could take what she wanted, but she didn't realize that I wasn't someone to mess with. As she was escorted away by the officers, all I could think was, justice had been served, and I'd finally turned the tables on her. That night I sat on the porch, the cool evening air washing over me, feeling a sense of calm. I didn't need to say a word. My actions spoke louder than any complaint she could have ever made. And just like that, the war was over. Karen had been taught her lesson, and I had regained control of my property. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner working overtime as I sat in my living room, staring at the screen of my phone, replaying the footage from the barn over and over again. It felt good to know that I was finally taking control of my own property. Karen had always thought she could push people around, but this time, she'd messed with the wrong person. As the sound of the police sirens faded into the distance, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction that she'd finally been caught red-handed. The officers had taken her away, but I knew this wasn't the last I'd be hearing from her. The HOA had always been a thorn in my side, but Karen had taken things to another level. She had crossed the line, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. As I sat there, waiting for the day to wind down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was more than just the satisfaction of knowing that I'd outsmarted her. No, there was something deeper at play here. I had spent too many years letting people walk all over me. I had spent too many nights questioning whether I was doing the right thing by staying quiet and keeping to myself. But now, I had found my voice, and I wasn't going to let it go. The next morning, I woke up early, as usual. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a warm orange glow over the fields outside my window. I stretched and yawned, making my way downstairs to grab a cup of coffee. The house was quiet, the way I liked it. I needed a moment of peace before the storm that was surely coming. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about what I was going to do next. Karen was bound to cause more trouble. She was the type who couldn't stand losing, and I knew she'd be back. But this time, I wasn't going to let her intimidate me. I had the law on my side now. I could feel the weight of my decision settle in. I had played the long game, and now it was my turn to make the rules. The next few days were filled with the usual hustle and bustle of farm life, feeding the animals, checking on the crops, and fixing the barn door that had been damaged during Karen's break-in. The work kept me busy, and it helped to clear my mind. But the thought of what to do next kept nagging at me. I had to make sure Karen understood that there were consequences for her actions. I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. I decided to take a step that would make it clear to everyone in the neighborhood that I wasn't someone to be trifled with. I called up a few of my friends, people I knew who had experience with the law, and asked for their advice. They were more than willing to help, and together, we put together a plan to deal with Karen once and for all. We weren't going to let her use her position in the HOA to manipulate people any longer. As I sat down with my friends, I could feel the adrenaline building inside me. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about making sure that no one ever felt like they could just take whatever they wanted from me or anyone else. It was time to take action. The plan was simple, but effective. We would use the footage from the barn to show that Karen had crossed the line, and we would make sure the HOA knew about it. We would expose her for what she really was, a bully who thought she could get away with anything because of her position. But this time, she wouldn't be able to hide behind her title. I couldn't wait to see the look on her face when she realized that she had finally met her match. The next day, I made the call. The HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, and I knew that would be the perfect time to bring everything to light. I was ready. I had my evidence, my plan, and a clear sense of purpose. It was time to take back control. I knew the HOA meeting was coming up, and I had one shot to make sure Karen paid for what she had done. The days felt like they were dragging on, but I kept myself busy with farm work, not letting my focus slip. I was ready. The footage was clear, the plan was in place, and my resolve had never been stronger. Karen had underestimated me, thinking that because I wasn't a lawyer or a politician, I couldn't fight back. But I had something better: patience, the law, and the support of people who knew how to navigate the system. When the day of the meeting finally arrived, I took a deep breath as I pulled into the parking lot of the community center. The place was packed, filled with the usual faces, neighbors, some looking skeptical, others hopeful, all here to hear the latest HOA gossip. But today, they were going to hear something else entirely. As I walked in, I could feel Karen's eyes on me immediately. She was sitting at the front, as usual, with her arms crossed, like she was waiting for me to make a mistake. But today, I wasn't going to make one. I took a seat in the back, silently waiting for the right moment. The meeting started with the usual complaints about grass heights and fence colors, but it didn't take long for the tension to shift. Finally, the moment came. I stood up and cleared my throat. All eyes turned to me. "Excuse me," I said, "I'd like to address something that's been bothering me." Karen's smirk faded slightly as she sat up straighter. She knew what was coming. "As many of you know," I continued, "there's been a lot of talk about property rights around here. Well, I think it's time we set the record straight about who actually has control of their own property." I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, holding it up for everyone to see. The room went quiet as I played the video of Karen breaking into my barn. The footage was crystal clear, showing her walking through the door, moving around, and even rifling through my belongings. Karen's face turned pale as the video played. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but I wasn't done yet. As you can see, I said, letting the video finish, Karen entered my property without permission. She trespassed, and that's a crime. The room was still. The other members of the HOA looked around at each other, shocked. They hadn't expected me to have evidence like this. They hadn't expected me to stand up like this. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but I raised my hand. I'm not finished, I said. This is more than just about one person's actions. This is about what happens when people think they can abuse their power. This is about what happens when someone feels entitled to treat others like their property doesn't matter. It's time we hold people accountable. The room was buzzing now, whispers filling the air. Karen's face was flushed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She tried to speak again, but the room wasn't having it. One of the other members, an older man named Mr. Henderson, stood up. Tom's right, he said. We can't let people run roughshod over others. I've lived here long enough to know that the rules are there for a reason, and it's not just to push people around. I could see Karen's grip on her composure slipping. The room had turned on her, and she knew it. The HOA members began murmuring in agreement. One by one, they spoke up, acknowledging that this kind of behavior wasn't acceptable. Finally, the president of the HOA, a man named Carl, stood up. He was known for being fair, and he was clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Karen, he said, we've seen the evidence. What do you have to say for yourself? Karen hesitated, then opened her mouth, but no words came out. She realized she was cornered. There was no way to talk her way out of this. After a long pause, Carl nodded. This meeting is adjourned, he said, his voice firm. The room emptied quickly, but not before I caught a few nods of approval from my neighbors. Karen tried to leave through the side door, but I could see the embarrassment on her face. She had been exposed. And I had won. It wasn't about the petty squabbles or the HOA's rules anymore. It was about taking a stand, showing everyone that when you stand up for what's right, you can take control back, no matter who you're up against. I woke up the next morning to a quiet that felt different, almost too still. The weight of the previous day's victory was heavy in the air, but I knew it was far from over. Karen hadn't just slinked away with her tail between her legs. She was a fighter, and I could already tell she wouldn't take this lying down. As I sipped my coffee, I thought back to the way she looked when the evidence had been presented. The shock in her eyes, the disbelief that someone had finally called her bluff. But that wasn't the end of it. No, Karen wasn't the type to let things go easily. I could almost hear her gears turning, figuring out how to get back at me, how to twist the situation in her favor. She was already plotting her next move, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. As the morning sun began to shine through the windows, I made a decision. I was going to take this opportunity to not only hold her accountable but to send a message to everyone in the neighborhood that I wasn't someone to be messed with. The HOA may have been in charge of enforcing the rules, but I was in charge of my own land. I grabbed my phone, opened my email, and started drafting a letter. It was time to get the truth out to the community. The letter would detail everything: the footage, the trespassing, the way Karen had overstepped her boundaries. I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what had happened. As I typed, I could already imagine Karen reading it. The frustration she would feel when she saw the words in black and white, knowing that there was no way to deny it. There was something satisfying about knowing she was going to face the consequences of her actions. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders. Now it was out of my hands. The neighborhood would know, and Karen would have nowhere to hide. Over the next few days, I saw the ripple effect. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down, afraid to speak out, started coming up to me. It was subtle at first, a friendly wave here, a quiet conversation there. But it was enough. People were starting to take notice, and Karen's little reign of terror was losing its grip. It didn't take long before I received a call from one of the HOA board members, a man named Greg. He was calm and collected, but I could hear the frustration in his voice. "Tom," he said, "we've been getting a lot of calls about Karen's behavior. People are asking questions, and it's starting to cause some real issues. We need to do something about this." It felt good to finally hear someone on the other side acknowledging the problem. "I agree," I said. "But I'm not the only one who's had issues with her. We all have. It's time for change." We talked for a few more minutes, and by the end of the conversation, Greg promised to bring it up in the next meeting. I wasn't sure if this would lead to anything, but it was a start. As the days passed, Karen's attitude began to shift. I could see the change in her. She wasn't walking around with that same smug confidence anymore. She wasn't making the rounds, bullying people into submission. Something was different. I could feel it in the way the air had changed in the neighborhood. People were starting to stand up. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Karen's grip on the HOA was loosening, and the power she had once wielded so carelessly was starting to slip away. She still tried to make her usual demands, but the tone had changed. People were beginning to question her, and that's all it took. She wasn't untouchable anymore. The community was no longer afraid. As for me, I knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: I wasn't backing down. Karen had started this fight, but I was going to finish it. I would make sure of it. The weeks that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. It was as if the whole neighborhood had collectively held its breath after the HOA meeting, waiting to see what would happen next. Karen's presence had significantly lessened, and the constant stream of complaints and power plays seemed to come to an abrupt halt. I kept my routine, working the farm, tending to the animals, and slowly repairing the little bits of damage from her last act of defiance. But there was a sense of change in the air, a subtle shift. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about the community. The people who had stayed silent for so long were now starting to feel empowered. The whispers I'd heard from my neighbors were growing louder. At the next HOA meeting, Greg, the board member I'd spoken to before, approached me with a different demeanor. His usual calm was now mixed with something else: determination. "Tom," he said quietly, pulling me aside before the meeting started, "I've spoken with several other board members, and we all agree. It's time for Karen to step down. We can't let her continue to manipulate this board any longer. We're moving forward." The weight of those words hit me harder than I expected. It was official. Karen's reign was ending, and she didn't even see it coming. The meeting began, and for once, it wasn't filled with the usual bickering. There was an undeniable tension in the room, but it wasn't the tension of fear or avoidance. It was the tension of people finally taking a stand. Greg opened the meeting with a simple statement: "We've had enough. It's time to put the interests of the community above the interests of one person." I could feel Karen stiffen at the mention of her. She wasn't used to being challenged, let alone called out in front of the entire neighborhood. The meeting continued with discussions about the changes that were needed. No longer were people afraid to speak up. One by one, neighbors shared their frustrations about Karen's aggressive tactics, the fines, the intimidation, and the way she'd used her position to bully others into submission. For the first time in a long while, it felt like the neighborhood was united, speaking with one voice. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, my hands steady despite the weight of the moment. "I think we all know the situation we're dealing with," I said, looking around the room. "But what matters now is what we do about it. We've given Karen enough chances. It's time for a change." The room was silent for a moment before a few people nodded in agreement. Karen was still silent, her face a mix of shock and anger. She knew what was coming. "I've already spoken with Greg," I continued, "and I believe it's time for this community to move forward. We cannot allow one person to dictate how we live. We need leadership that will put the needs of everyone above personal gain." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. I could see Karen trying to process what was happening, but it was too late. The community had spoken. After a few more exchanges, Greg called for a vote. The motion was clear: Karen was to be removed from her position as HOA president. The vote passed with overwhelming support. Karen's face turned red as she stood, attempting to say something, but no words came. She stormed out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. I stayed seated, feeling a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about personal revenge anymore. This was about making sure that people knew they weren't alone. This was about restoring fairness and accountability. The meeting continued with discussions on how to move forward, but my mind was already on the next steps. I knew this victory was just the beginning. The real work would be in making sure that the community remained strong, that we all continued to support each other. But for now, I could feel the weight of the past months lifting. Karen had lost, and we had won. It was a victory that would ripple through the neighborhood for a long time to come. In the weeks that followed Karen's removal, the neighborhood slowly began to find its rhythm again. The tension that had been hanging over us for so long finally seemed to dissipate. People started speaking to each other more openly, and the oppressive weight of constant surveillance and judgment that Karen had imposed began to fade. I could tell that a change was in the air. Even the smallest things were different. When I walked down the street, neighbors who used to avoid eye contact now waved, some even stopping to chat. It was a strange but welcome feeling to see people standing tall, no longer afraid to voice their opinions or share their frustrations. But the change wasn't just in the people, it was in the way the community operated. At the next HOA meeting, things were different. Greg, who had taken on more responsibility since Karen's departure, started introducing new ideas. He suggested we focus more on building a community that was collaborative, not controlling. We could finally discuss things that mattered, like improving the shared spaces and making sure everyone's voice was heard. For the first time in years, I felt like the HOA was actually working for the people, not against them. I wasn't the only one noticing the shift. A few days after the meeting, Greg called me to say there was something important he wanted to discuss. I was curious but didn't expect much more than a follow-up on the meeting. When we met, he got straight to the point. Tom, he said, I've been talking to a lot of people, and there's a real sense of unity now. I think it's time for us to do something that's going to set a real example. I listened closely, knowing that whatever he had in mind, it was going to be something big. We've been talking about ways to improve the community, but I think it's time we start with something that'll make a real difference, Greg continued. What if we could create a neighborhood event, something that brings everyone together, something that shows we're a community again, not just a group of houses? The idea hit me immediately. We could organize a neighborhood barbecue, something casual, where people could meet each other and have a good time. No agendas, no HOA rules, just people enjoying each other's company. It seemed like the perfect way to celebrate the changes we had made and show Karen's old influence that it was gone for good. We started planning, and soon the word spread. It didn't take long for people to get excited. Some offered to cook, others volunteered to set up tables and decorations. It was incredible to see how many people were willing to pitch in. It was as if they were finally free to contribute without fear of being judged or reprimanded. The day of the barbecue, the weather was perfect. The sun was out, but the air was cool enough to enjoy being outside. The tables were lined with food, and the laughter of neighbors filled the air. It was nothing extravagant, but it felt like everything we had been waiting for. There were kids running around, dogs playing in the yard, and adults talking and laughing as if they had known each other for years. I walked around, shaking hands, chatting with people I'd never spoken to before. It felt good to be part of something, to see the community come together like this. As the day went on, I realized that this was more than just a barbecue. It was a symbol. It was a reminder of what we had fought for, and what we had gained. We had taken back our community, and we weren't going to let anyone tear it apart again. As the sun began to set, the group of us sat together, enjoying the last of the food and drinks. I looked around at the people I had come to know better over the past few weeks, and realized that the real victory wasn't about Karen's removal, or any of the small battles we had fought along the way. The real victory was the feeling of unity, of knowing that we had built something stronger than the walls of any HOA or the power of one person's control. We had built something that was ours, together. The weeks after the neighborhood barbecue were full of quiet satisfaction. Things had settled into a rhythm, and the tension that had once clouded our community was slowly becoming a thing of the past. People were starting to really connect, and there was a noticeable shift in how everyone interacted. Karen's absence was felt, but it wasn't the absence of her oppressive presence, it was the absence of fear. The HOA meetings were more relaxed, discussions were productive, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it seemed like everyone had a voice. Greg had taken on more responsibility, but it wasn't just him. The board was more unified, and the priorities were shifting. The focus was on community, not control. As the weeks went by, I started to realize something. Things had changed, not just for the neighborhood, but for me too. I had spent so much time avoiding conflict, thinking it would all just blow over, hoping that if I stayed quiet, things would get better. But now, I understood the power of standing up for yourself and your community. I had seen firsthand how one person could make a difference. And it wasn't just about fighting back against someone like Karen, it was about what you did after the fight. It was about building something better in the aftermath. One evening, as I was sitting on the porch, enjoying the peace, Greg called me again. His voice was more serious this time. "Tom," he said, "I need to talk to you about something. It's about the HOA." My heart sank a little. I couldn't imagine what this was about. "What's going on?" I asked. "It's about the direction we're heading," he said. "I think it's time we really start making some bigger changes. We need to overhaul how we run things, not just make small tweaks. We've got the chance to make this place something special, and I think you can help." I was silent for a moment, processing what he was saying. "What do you mean?" I finally asked. "I'm thinking about running for a position on the board," he said. "But I need someone with your vision. Someone who gets it." The weight of what he was suggesting hit me. He was asking me to get involved, to help guide the future of the community. And honestly, it was a little intimidating. But at the same time, it felt right. I had been given the opportunity to make a difference, to help steer things in the right direction, and I wasn't going to let that slip away. "Okay," I said finally. "Let's do it." The next few weeks were filled with more planning and meetings. There was a lot to discuss, a lot of logistics to figure out, but the energy in the air was different this time. It wasn't the same fear-driven urgency that had plagued the HOA before. It was focused, determined, and there was a sense of purpose behind everything we did. The community was starting to feel like a real team. As the election for the HOA board came up, I found myself standing in front of a small group of neighbors, giving my first speech. It was simple, but it came from the heart. I talked about how important it was to put people first, to make sure that the HOA worked for everyone, not just a few. I talked about how we needed to build a community that valued fairness, transparency, and respect for each other. And I talked about how we needed to make sure that no one ever felt like they were being pushed around by the system again. When it was over, I felt a sense of pride I hadn't felt in a long time. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the whole neighborhood, working together to create something better. The vote came, and to my surprise, I was elected to the board. It was a small victory, but it felt like a big step forward. It felt like we were finally taking control of our own destiny. And as I stood there, looking around at the faces of my neighbors, I realized that this was just the beginning. We had built something stronger than just a neighborhood. We had built a community. A community that would stand up for each other, that would fight for fairness, and that would never let anyone feel like they didn't belong. And I was proud to be a part of that. Proud to be part of something that was bigger than any one person. Proud to know that the best was yet to come. Months passed, and the changes continued to unfold. The neighborhood felt different, lighter, more connected, like something had been unlocked that we hadn't even known was there. The days of fearing Karen's rule were over, but there was still work to be done. The election to the HOA board wasn't just a personal win, it was a collective one. The momentum we had built wasn't going to fade. I kept meeting with Greg and the other board members, and we kept pushing forward, making sure the community stayed on track. We started focusing on things that had always been neglected: the shared spaces, the streets that needed repairs, and the parks that hadn't been tended to in years. People had more trust in the process now, and it was amazing to see how willing they were to pitch in. The sense of ownership was contagious. I watched as more and more neighbors started taking pride in their properties, not because they were afraid of a fine or an overbearing HOA president, but because they genuinely cared about the place they lived. It was about creating something that was more than just houses. It was about building a true community. We set up meetings for everyone to share their ideas, and it was incredible to see how much talent and creativity was out there. From landscaping ideas to volunteer programs, it felt like people were finally finding their voice. We even started a neighborhood newsletter to keep everyone informed and involved. The excitement was palpable. It wasn't just about fixing things up, it was about doing it together, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, as I was walking to the community center for a meeting, I ran into Mrs. Chin, the elderly woman who had been my neighbor for years. She was carrying a basket of fresh vegetables from her garden, as usual, and she smiled when she saw me. "Tom," she said, her voice warm, "I wanted to thank you for what you've done for this place. It feels like home again." Her words stuck with me. This was it. This was what it was all about. The community wasn't just a place where people lived, it was a place where people cared for each other, looked out for each other, and shared something deeper. That afternoon, I thought back to everything that had happened, the frustration, the anger, the fear, and realized how far we had come. We had fought for our neighborhood, not with anger or resentment, but with determination and the belief that we could create something better. And now, as I looked around at the thriving community we had built, I knew we had. The next HOA meeting was different, too. There was a new energy in the room. People were eager to contribute, to talk about the future, and to make sure we kept building on what we had achieved. There was no longer any fear of a single person taking control. Everyone had a say, and it felt like we were all working towards the same goal. As I left the meeting that day, I felt a sense of pride that was different from before. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about what we had done together. We had transformed our neighborhood into something special. And as I looked ahead, I knew this was just the beginning. The road wouldn't always be easy, but I was ready for whatever came next. The community was strong, and together, we were unstoppable. As time went on, the changes we had fought for continued to unfold. The once fragmented and tense community now stood united, stronger than ever. I could see the difference in the people around me. Their smiles were genuine, their interactions more open, and the sense of belonging was palpable. For the first time, I felt like we were truly a neighborhood, not just a group of houses separated by fences. Greg and I continued working on the board, and the momentum never slowed. We tackled bigger projects, like fixing the roads that had been neglected for years and improving the communal park where kids now played freely. We focused on making Willowbrook Estates a place people wanted to be, a place where everyone's voice mattered, and no one was above the community. One Saturday afternoon, I was out front, tending to the garden, when I saw a familiar face approaching. It was Mrs. Chin, smiling as she walked toward me with a basket of freshly baked bread. She had been my neighbor for years, and her quiet strength had always been a source of inspiration for me. As she reached my driveway, she handed me the basket with a warm smile. "I wanted to thank you again, Tom," she said, her eyes bright with appreciation. "This neighborhood, it feels like home again. People are happy, they're talking to each other, helping each other. It's like it was before, but better." Her words meant more than she knew. They were a reminder of why we had fought so hard, why we had stood up to Karen and the old ways. It wasn't just about the small victories. It was about making something lasting, something that would stand the test of time. A community built on respect, trust, and fairness. As I took the bread and thanked her, I couldn't help but feel proud of what we had done together. It wasn't just about getting rid of the bad elements, or making changes for the sake of change. It was about building a foundation, one that would last and continue to grow for generations to come. Later that week, Greg stopped by to check on the progress of the park renovations. We stood there, surveying the area, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. We could both feel it, the sense of accomplishment, of knowing we had done something good. Something real. It's incredible, Greg finally said, breaking the silence. I never thought we'd get here. But look at this place now. Look at what we've done. I nodded, my gaze sweeping over the park, the freshly mowed grass, the playground equipment shining in the sunlight. We've made something special, I said. And we're just getting started. The next few months were filled with even more positive changes. We held community events, from cookouts to clean-up days, where people came together to help improve the neighborhood, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. We built bonds, not out of fear or obligation, but out of mutual respect. Every corner of Willowbrook Estates seemed to reflect this new spirit. The old tensions were gone, replaced by a sense of shared purpose and camaraderie. People who had once avoided each other now greeted each other with smiles. It was a different place, a better place, and I was proud to be a part of it. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I realized something. This wasn't just about the neighborhood anymore. It was about everything I had learned along the way. The power of standing up for what's right. The importance of community. The strength in unity. And the realization that change, when it comes from the heart, is unstoppable. I had seen it in the faces of my neighbors, in the way they interacted with each other, in the way they cared. I had seen it in myself. And I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The future was wide open, and I was ready to continue building, to keep moving forward with the same sense of purpose that had carried us all this far. Because the truth was, the work wasn't over. It had only just begun.